In today's video, we are sewing the Crosshatch grid design, and this is one of my go-to quilting designs that I love using for my quilts. This looks way more complicated than it actually is, and I promise you, you will not have to deal with any complicated angles. Hi, I'm Tom and I am the Colourblind Quilter, and you are watching This Is How You Quilt It. We're making a flip book of quilting samples, and there are 21 all over fast and easy to sew quilting designs. When the time comes to sit down and sew your quilt, you will have plenty of designs to choose from. If you are just starting out in this series, welcome. Thank you for joining us. In the description below, you'll find a worksheet that has all the fabric and prep that you need to do to sew this series. In the corner and also in the description below will be the link to the playlist, and you can catch up on all the videos so far and then keep following along as new ones are released. So let's get started then. Now, as I mentioned, this is one of my favorite designs that I regularly go to when it comes to quilting projects, and I particularly like this for wall hangings and table runners, although I do use it on other quilts as well. It does look more challenging than it actually is, and in fact you probably think that I'm going to be telling you to use all the angled lines on your ruler, and you absolutely don't need to. The hardest part of this design is choosing how far apart to put your lines. This is simple and easy on square quilts, but it does also work on rectangular quilts. It just needs a little bit more planning, but it's really not that difficult to make it work. On the difficulty score, this gets a 2 out of 5. And on the cuddle rating, this also gets a 2 out of 5. If you want to make a denser grid, i.e. put your lines closer together, that will increase the cuddle rating and make a stiffer quilt. But in the example that I'm showing you, this is a 2 out of 5. So let's look at the prep required to make this design happen. So to start, we are going to mark an X on our square, and we are going to do this from corner to corner. With your ruler and whatever you're marking your fabric with, draw your first line from top left to bottom right corner, then rotate and then draw your second line. And now we have an X going through the block. And by doing it this way, this is how we don't need to worry about any angles. Now, in my instance, I am doing lines 1 1/4 inches apart because I want my lines to be symmetrical and I don't want any large gaps in any corners. 1 1/4 inch distance gives me a nice symmetrical grid. When you are choosing your distance, be sure to check the number of lines by taking the width and dividing it by the distance. And if you get a whole number like 7, 8, 9, then it will look symmetrical. If you get a decimal like 8.2, 9.6, then it's going to have a strange gap at the side. So make sure you figure this out before you start drawing your lines. With your ruler, I line up the 1 1/4 inch on my guideline that I've just drawn, and then I mark a line and then I repeat. Now we've got to be careful that these lines stay straight. So what we're doing is we are making sure that the previously drawn lines are lining up with marks and lines on our rulers, and this is going to help us to stay straight. And you can see I'm working from the center up towards the right corner. Then when I've done that, I'm going to rotate it, and then I'm going to start again in the center and work out to the corner again. And that gives me half of the lines that I need. Now we rotate this 90 degrees and we start on the other side, starting again by lining up the 1 1/4 inch line on your ruler with the center guideline, marking your line, and then using the lines on the ruler to line up with the lines you've drawn and do from the center out to the corner, rotate, and then center out to the corner. And that's how you mark your crosshatch grid without needing to worry about any angles. Now when it comes to sewing this, we are going to start by sewing those X lines, and this will secure our sample. Starting in the corner, lining up the line up with the needle, and then sew all the way down, and then when you get to the bottom, cut your threads. Rotate 90 degrees and then sew the second line. And now your sample is secure. You can remove any pins at this point if you are using pins. And then, like the design previously, the grids for days, all we have to do is sew all our lines. there's your design. And you can see a beautiful crosshatch grid. This really was not difficult. And a lot of people get put off by angled grids because they worry about having to use the angle lines on the ruler. But by doing it this way, you don't have to worry about the angle lines. You just need to use the corners of the square to find the angles without actually having to measure the angles, which is what makes this so clever. If you want to challenge your straight sewing skills, I would mark the initial X, then I would sew them. Then I would get my walking foot guide, set it to the distance, and then I would align it with the sewn lines and then use that to guide me across the sample. This is a great challenge to your sewing straight skills. Make sure you space your grid according to the batting that you're using so that you don't end up with lumps and bumps or batting that's moving. The closer your grid lines are, the denser your design will be, which is perfect for things like table runnings and wall hangings. If you want a softer, fluffier quilt, just space them further apart. For example, 4 or 5 inches apart on a large quilt would create a nice, soft, fluffy quilt. Just make sure though that whatever distance you decide on, that you check that it will be symmetrical so there are no weird gaps in the corners. Now let's take a look at some of the example quilts. And I do have square and rectangular quilts to show you how this works. So for our first example quilt, we are using my favorite carpenter star example that you've seen me using over the last couple of videos. Now this is a great quilt to use for this, firstly because it's square, so that means that we don't need to worry about our angles by just using lines from corner to corner. And then secondly, because this is actually constructed of a square block, i.e. a half square triangle, we can use the crosshatch grid to highlight and emphasize parts of this design. So if you zoom in and have a little look at the center, you can see how the square from the stitch lines is highlighting the half square triangle. And then as we come out, you can see how it just creates these secondary patterns to the background areas, creating what looks like a 4 patch on point, or it looks like an X blocks going through the other background squares there on the outside of the inner star. Now I just love the way that this looks. I think it really works very nicely, emphasizing parts of the quilt. If you were making this quilt and you were wanting to use this design, what I suggest you do is look at the finished size of your half square triangles, i.e. the size they are once they've been sewn into the quilt, and then space your grid according to that so you will get this effect. But this is very nice and it also creates lots of lovely texture in that border. You can also see where it looks like squares on point running down the border, and that's just from planning my spacing out so that I get that nice diamond-esque effect in the border. So this is lovely. Now the winding ways quilt, for example number 2, is to show you how this works with a curved quilt. Now on first glance you're going to look at this and be like, Tom, wow, like your lines are all over the place, like what were you thinking? But I had very definite reasons for doing this. So you'll notice that this is not a square crosshatch grid. This is made up of squares and rectangles. The squares are highlighting certain parts of the quilt, and then the rectangles are highlighting other parts. Now I like this because I could have just gone straight down the middle of the blocks diagonally from corner to corner and then spaced it out that way. But instead I decided to offset it from the center to create just a slightly different visual look for this. Now it is a bit more irregular, and I think that works very nicely with the curved piecing. It kind of chops the quilt into different pieces and gives you different things to look at as your eye scans across this quilt. Now if you're asking me how you would do this, because we're talking about not using angles, and in square quilts we're talking about using corner to corner so we don't have to worry about those angles, this is how I would do it. I would still mark a line from corner to corner diagonally on both sides of the square to give us our X. And then I would decide the distance that my lines needed to be, and I would mark them out according to it. And when it came time to sew this, I would skip sewing that initial X and just erase those lines, just using them as guidelines to space everything else out. When you do a design like this, you do want to plan this before you mark your lines, just in case it doesn't quite work out. So for some suggestions for that, you might want to use masking tape, and this could perhaps give you an idea of where the lines will go, and if you need to adjust and move them around, that will allow you to do this without having to erase loads of lines. So that is the winding ways, and it just shows you if you change the spacing of your grid, you can get a slightly different look, but still looks really effective. Now, example number 3, we're using the on point quilt again. Now you remember from the last video, the grids for days video, how we used the horizontal and vertical lines to emphasize the fact that the quilt was on point. Now, what we're doing in this one is we're actually using it to emphasize the diagonal lines through this quilt. So first off, yes, it's a rectangular quilt, and the method that I talk about still very much works without needing to worry about angles. You just notice that when you go from the top left corner down, you reach the right side, but it's not the bottom right corner, but that's okay. And then you do that for all the corners, drawing the line to wherever it reaches on the opposite side, and then you use those still as your guidelines. And so therefore you still don't need to worry about angles. Secondly, what I've done is I've made sure that my grid goes right through the center of each of those checkerboard quilts to create a cross right through the middle of it. And then I've used my spacing so that I'm highlighting round the edges of the checkerboard block. And so that's what I've done with the blocks. But the effect that this has in the background is it creates what looks like a 4-patch on point. So it chops that background up into a 4-patch. And this works very nicely and creates lots of texture and lots of movement through this quilt. And so if you have a quilt on point, doing a diagonal grid like this can work very nicely to emphasize the fact that it is a quilt on point and that there are diagonal features in that quilt. So maybe think about that next time you're doing an on-point quilt. Okay, now our final example is a little bit special. This is my square in a square quilt. Now, you might be looking at this thinking, oh, that looks really complicated. I can't do that. That's far too difficult, Tom. You're just, what are you talking about? But no, I promise, this is really simple, okay? So bear with me. Look at the red blocks, the red square and the square blocks, and let's look at how the line intersects through it. From the top right down to the bottom left, the lines of stitching intersect straight through the middle diagonally of that square in the square block. And so it creates a grid of lines from top right to bottom left. Okay, that's step 1. Now step 2, we want to repeat that for the grey blocks, but we're going to go from top left to bottom right. So on every grey block, I've put a line that diagonally intersects through the middle of that stitched block. Okay, step 2. Now finally, just to finish it off and to create these secondary patterns that I'm going to talk about in a second, again, looking at the red blocks going from right to left, I have drawn lines or stitched lines that go from the top left corner of the block across the quilt down to the top left corner of the bottom row. And then I have done the same thing using the bottom right corner of the red blocks. This is more complicated than it sounds, I promise. Then I've just repeated that for the grey blocks, but going from left to right. And so by doing that, it creates a couple of secondary patterns here. So first of all, look at the center and notice how it creates that 8-pointed star. That's really, really nice. Second, it creates what looks like a 4-patch with borders on point throughout the quilt. If you look at the stitch lines slightly from further back, you'll see what I mean about the 4 patches on point. It creates that really nice effect. And then finally, the third thing that it does is it creates these little diamond-esque shapes in the border where the lines are crossing. And I really like that, and I really like how that works out in the corners as well. This is an example of where a really simple quilting design, like a crosshatch grid, where when you think about how the lines intersect through blocks, how you can create a really stunning quilting effect with very little effort. Honestly, it just looks fantastic. And it looks really complicated, and it's so not complicated at all. Now, to plan this, it's similar to the winding ways. What you'd want to do is mark reference lines from the top left to the bottom right corners, and then the top right to the bottom left corners to create that X shape like we did in the quilt block. And you can use that for then spacing your lines apart. But I was genuinely so pleased with how this turned out, and I am making a square in a square quilt later this year for the video that I'm working on. And so this is how I'm going to quilt that design, because it's just love it. So that's my 4 example quilts. I really hope that you like them, and I really hope that you found some of the things I talked about helpful. So that was the crosshatch grid, one of my favorite go-to designs that I like to use for my table runners and wall hanging. And hopefully those example quilts, in particular the rectangular quilts, will help to show you what's possible with this design, which is a great one to have in your toolbox for quilts. Don't forget there will be an accompanying book to this video series, which will have all of these 21 designs, step-by-step instructions and diagrams, as well as all the example quilts and more that I've been been showing you, and I'll also be packing 9 more designs that will not be featured in this video series for you. So it'll be a great resource to have in your studio. So you won't want to miss out when that gets released. So sign up to the mailing list below and you'll get notified when it's available for pre-orders. As you're sewing along with this video series, I would love you to share your progress on Instagram using the hashtag #ThisIsHowYouQuiltIt. And don't forget to tag me, the Colorblind Quilter, so I can see all the samples that you have been making. In the next design number 7, I'm going to be showing how to take this crosshatch grid to the next level with a divided crosshatch. So if you like this video, please do consider giving it a thumbs up and make sure you are subscribed and you click that bell so you get notified when the next video in this series is released. And until next time, take care.